When it comes to Peru, the country is unraveling at warp speed. Just last week, Peru's President Pedro Castillo was removed from office. His charge, quote, rebellion, which came after he announced that he would shut down Congress. Enter Castillo's Vice President Dina Boluarte, who was sworn in as the new president, becoming the first female head of state in Peru's history. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at what has happened in Peru and whether the U.S., who has shown support for the coup and the new president, had any role in it. First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Spotlight. Arnold August joins us. He's an author and journalist from Montreal. Also joining us is Libre Sankara, who's a contributor at the Troika Kollective, joining us from Miami. Welcome to you both. Libre Sankara, I'll start with you. If you can please tell us in so many words, what has happened in Peru? What did Pedro Castillo do to be dealt the harsh hand that he has been dealt with at this point?
So what we have happening in Peru is not anything new to the history. Peruvian politics have unfortunately developed into what is happening today. So what happens? Pedro Castillo represents the indigenous community. He comes from a working class background, and he represents a move towards Peru that acknowledges the role of working class people, of indigenous people, and so he poses a threat to the working class, or he poses a threat to the far right people that come from like Fujimori and the Fujimoristas. He also was pushing for a new constitution, which is one of the platforms that he ran on and got high approval for. And so Pedro Castillo represents what the far right fears, which is Peru moving towards a working class politic that benefits the working class people of Peru and the indigenous people of Peru. And this is a very scary thing, which is why a coup has been orchestrated. What Pedro Castillo was pushing for in dissolving Congress is nothing new. In fact, the president prior to him did it, and many other presidents have done it. It's part of their constitution that a president can dissolve Congress if they feel they're not able to move forward. And so Pedro Castillo, unfortunately, is part of a larger plan to continue destabilizing Peru, so that U.S. corporations and people like the U.S. ambassador can continue to take advantage of of Peru as a mineral-rich country and a country that is full of working-class people.
Okay, very good. We're going to get to some of those points a little later, but first, trying to understand how Peru has unraveled at the speed that it has, Arnold August. And our guest there mentioned something that is very key in this, and that is the fact that this is not anything new what Pedro Castillo did, which was in essence, to be more concrete here, it was Article 134 that is something that he enacted, which was only going to be a temporary closure from what we understand, in which the president said new congressional elections would then be held as soon as possible. So are we to take the fact that what was then done to him was part of, as our guest there mentioned, of a bigger plan to oust him?
Yes, of course. I'm quite sure right after he got elected, I'm sure that the United States and their allies in Europe and Canada started to go into action in order to plan what we call lawfare, that is using juridical or so-called legal means to overthrow the elected president. And we just discussed the question of the United States' role. I mean, the day before his arrest and the coup took place, the day before, the American embassy in Peru met. So they are directly involved in that. And I think that the fact that he dissolved the Congress, I perfectly believe it is a correct decision, while some, middle of the roaders are saying, well, we oppose what happened to him, but the fact that he dissolved the Congress was not right. It was right, because right now, who has the last word on this? It should be the people in the streets. And the people in the streets in Peru right now are calling for a constituent assembly. That is to replace that Congress. So that decision was right, I think, legally, morally, and also historically, because it opens up a new path for the people in the street. And we saw, when we discussed these type of governments before at Press TV, I always presented the position that we cannot, whether it's the left part of the left tide or not, I was always of the opinion we cannot concentrate on the personalities who won elections. For example, Boric in Chile, and now Castillo in Peru. What we have to look at is the larger picture. Where did Castillo come from? He came from a mass movement of indigenous workers. He himself is a teacher, and that what brought him into power. And that is why, on the ground now, that you were talking about the left, the pink tide. The pink tide in Peru is happening right now.
Indeed. Well, tell us your reaction, if you can, Libre Sankara, to the move that the VP, Dina Boluarte, made and then became the president, where she accused the president of, the former, I don't want to call him the former president, but it appears that way for now, Castillo, of a coup attempt. And then basically it just happened a few hours later, from what we understand, where she became the president. She was sworn in. I mean, why would she be the one chosen for this, do you think? At this point, obviously, we're seeing the backlash on the streets. So is that a miscalculation on the part of the grand scheme of things?
I think what we have is betrayal. The ambassador, the U.S. met with Dina Boluarte, the so-called president of Peru, and given the trajectory of Peruvian politics, it's also highly unlikely that she herself is going to last until the 2026 elections. And again, Pedro Castillo is the only democratically elected president. The people did not elect Dina Boluarte to lead them, and I think this speaks to the move and the direction that Peru was trying to go into. The comrade just spoke about pink tide, and I think what we see happening in Latin America right now is the U.S. trying to impose unipolarity, and we see pink tide 2.0 coup and coup attempts. This is happening in Peru. They're using lawfare in Argentina, and they're trying to do another coup in Bolivia. And all these happen to be countries that are moving further to the left. So Dina Boluarte is just a pawn in the larger grand scheme of the U.S. trying to maintain its exploitative relationship to countries like Peru, that if they are to develop for the Peruvian masses of people, the indigenous Peruvians, the working class Peruvians, that Peru could in fact stand on its own 2 feet and not have to be dependent on the U.S. In this very parasitic, exploitative relationship. And Europe is just as guilty in this as well. And so,
how is Europe guilty?
Europe is guilty because they're playing more of from the corporate side of things. Their corporations, the mining, are all corporations that are in Europe, and as well as the U.S. It's kind of like a joint venture.
Sure,
and
indeed.
so.
Well, so many people have referred to the EU being a vassal state of the U.S. But let's look into the situation more with the U.S. interference, Arnold August, as both of you have indicated that occurred. Now, we also understand that a day before, this U.S. ambassador, who is a former CIA agent, also met with, I guess, the defense minister, from what we understand, a retired brigadier general, which then, we understand, he ordered the military to turn against Castillo. So this is not something that has happened in a matter of just 24, 48 hours. As both of you have indicated, in a sense, this is a scheme, a plan that the U.S., in conjunction with different players within Peru's political apparatus, had planned before. Am I correct to look at it that way?
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. And you and our guest just mentioned the the United States and other actors such as Europe. Allow me to point out to another actor that is much more vigorous in support of the coup than the Europeans, and that is Canada. Canada is right from the start took the following position, saying they issued a one-sentence statement saying Canada would like to express its deep concern over Castillo's attempt to dissolve Congress and establish a government of exception in Peru. Such destabilizing actions risk jeopardizing Peru's adherence to democracy. And if that is not enough, another statement from Canada came out the day later. Canada calls for calm and invites all actors. That's a very famous line from Canada, all actors. When the revolt was taking place in Chile a couple of years ago, and it was obvious the use of the army and the carboneros in actually killing and maiming people, they always call for all actors to avoid tensions and all that. Now, I cannot help myself to make the comparison. While the Trudeau government jumps right from start one, run from game one, the first day, in opposing the demonstrations of millions of people in Peru, indigenous workers, against the coup. In Iran, they support the US-led riots that are taking place in Iran. So I think it's important for people to really have a good grasp of the dirty role that Canada plays through Justin Trudeau as the most faithful ally of U.S. imperialism, not only in Latin America, but internationally.
Sure. Well, they have played destructive roles when we go through the different actions that have been executed, with U.S. being in the lead in many of them. But before we get to that, let's look at some of the reactions, Libre Sankara, of Latin American leaders, because you have many of the governments. At last count, there were 7 of them, where you have yes, Mexico, Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, Honduras, Venezuela, Cuba, and some other nations at this point who have criticized and refused to recognize Peru's unelected coup regime, as they have called it. Is that going to make a difference in the fate of Peru and where it's headed when you have this opposition of this magnitude?
I think what it symbolizes is a shift towards multipolarity, a shift away from U.S. Imperialism and its role in Latin America in general. I think things like this will become more frequent. I don't know that it will have tangible presence in Peru itself. I think the Peruvian people, the ronderos that come from these indigenous communities that helped to have this historical victory to elect Pedro Castillo as president. I think between them and Peru-Libre and other left factions in Peru will ultimately play the most important roles. But I think what these statements help do is to help the Peruvian people understand that they have the solidarity of other countries. I don't know that these countries are going to send any real firm resources to help Peruvians fight against this. But I also see countries like Mexico trying to talk with the government to offer Pedro Castillo asylum. In fact, when he realized what was happening, he tried to go to the Mexican embassy, and he was barred from doing that by his security detail. And shortly after, he was detained. And so we have to be very vigilant of what's going to continue to happen. Unfortunately, more Peruvians are going to be killed because again, they democratically elected Pedro Castillo. They want him in office. They are going out into the streets, but this is being met by the far right that has no problem killing people, that has no problem harming its own citizens to maintain its own greedy benefit that these far-right Fujimorista type of people hope to continue. They want to continue being in positions of power and exploiting their own people and getting business deals. And so the 7 countries, and I'm sure there will be more to follow, are simply showing their solidarity with the working class people. Hopefully that shows up in tangible ways, But as in the foreseeable future, it doesn't look like they're going to send any material things. This is symbolic, and it's helpful to
Sure.
build morale, but that's about it.
Okay, well, Arnold August, our guest, also mentioned the pink tide. And we've seen what has happened in the past couple of years in terms of the political landscape that is characterized by the term pink tide, where you have these left-wing presidents to pretty much come into power because they are the ones that actually represent the true people out in the broad economy and society of the different countries that they represent. I mean, one of the most, I guess, prolific ones would be the Brazilian President Lula da Silva that came out in some sense, and him winning the presidency was very was an eye-opener, I would guess, from the U.S. perspective, because he made one announcement, and that was how he wants there to be a move away from the dollar. He wants the local economies of each country to deal in their national currencies. Are we looking at this to have ticked off the U.S., this new wave of left-wing presidents, as they say, and therefore they are now counter-reacting to that?
Yes, I would say so. I just add, both of you rightly mentioned all of the presidents and leaders of the Latin American countries that took a firm stand publicly in support of Castillo. I would add one other block that just came out, I think, yesterday, and that is ALBA, which includes many countries, including in the small Caribbean island. In terms of the current situation, I think aside from what happened to Christina Kirchner a couple of weeks ago, this attempt here is the first attempt of a coup since the election of Lula in Brazil. You know, I think that is going to make a big difference. Brazil, of course, as everyone knows, it's a major player in Latin America, and through BRICS, it has important ties with other important countries such as China, India, South Africa, and Russia. And the way China is now increasingly making its presence felt on the international scale with regards to other countries, for example, just a few days ago, making a clear statement in support of the right of Palestine to its own state with its capital in East Jerusalem. The United States might have some surprises, as not only the countries in Latin America that perhaps feel more confident, more boldened since the election of Brazil, but even internationally, this may build up further, and it will be a very hard. It may be a very hard situation for the United States and its allies to face while Castillo is in prison. And everyone is against that in Peru and many countries of the world, not only in Latin America.
Okay. The fact that you came out right away pretty much, Libre Sankara, and talked about how you have Castillo that represents the indigenous population there in Peru, and the fact that he is the one that was able to edge out in the vote because he had the common people be on his side. Tell us the way that this has backfired for the ones that were in control of the major industries and how they felt threatened, and perhaps given the fact that they have connections, and I'm just making the connection here, and whether it's accurate or not is up for you to tell us, and that these, for example, we know that Castillo brought in a lot of new ministers, and I'm guessing just that fact itself might have threatened the livelihoods of some of these people who, I don't know if I want to call them oligarchs or not, but you know, the ones that were in power in different sectors and fields of the economy. And therefore, they obviously sided with the motion to try to oust Castillo. And that's where the U.S. connection also comes in, because you have Peru that has a lot of important natural resources, gold being the #1, from what I understand, natural resource of Peru. Is that a correct reading into this?
Yeah, that is an accurate reading. And in fact, I mean, Peru, since the colonial times, has been taken advantage of by foreign interests. And so what Castillo represents is indigenous working class, right? Like, this is somebody that when they were giving speeches, they spoke in the indigenous language, which brought a lot of the elected officials to anger, because their status quo is to speak Spanish, to kind of take on this more. It's not educated to speak like that, and this demonization of indigenous people in a country that's mostly indigenous. They just until Pedro Castillo were not in positions of power. They weren't being appointed. Their perspectives were not being brought into policies. Their perspectives were not being brought into the proposed new constitution, which is something that has also been happening during the peak tide. A lot of these left governments have been rewriting their constitutions or codifying new laws. For example, Cuba just passed its family codes, and Chile, unfortunately, didn't vote, but they were looking to rewrite their own constitution. And so Pedro Castillo also represents and came from the Peru-Libre party, which he appointed a Marxist-Leninist in his cabinet, which unfortunately the individual had to step down because shortly after being put into his position, he got death threats. And this just shows how status quo the career politicians want to keep Peru. Again, Peru, with such rich economy and such access to resources, has been a country that has been overexploited and underdeveloped. And this works to the benefit of these career politicians and to foreign interests instead of the interests of Peruvians. And so Pedro Castillo represented and still represents a move towards a new type of Peru, a Peru that is moving left and closer to a Peru for Peruvians themselves. And so this scares people that don't want that to be the reality because it doesn't benefit their pockets.
Okay.
And so that's why millions of Peruvians are out in the streets protecting and asking for his release.
All right, final question. Obviously, I have to ask, where is Peru going to be headed, Arnold August? I mean, we're looking, and I can't help every time I hear the word indigenous to think of Bolivia, and actually draw a parallel here, because we've seen what happened, and interestingly, whether it's a coincidence or not, you had a woman there also who's now in jail, but she was the one that replaced the president there. Right. At this point, we're looking at Boluarte, who has said, I'm not stepping down, even though there's protests that are happening, even though there are deaths that are occurring, and there have been given strict orders, I guess, to treat the protesters harshly. What are we looking at in terms of the future of Peru, just in the next weeks or months to come?
Well, I think that this whole move by the United States and its allies to organize this soft coup against Castillo, the fact that the main target, as we've been mentioning the last few minutes, are indigenous people, poor people, this could have the resistance to the U.S. move and its oligarchy in Peru can have a very serious backlash against them because indigenous people are very, very, very interested in defending their own cultural heritage. We saw that in Bolivia, when despite the bloody attempts to keep the revolution down, they actually fought and won back their right to be the governing force in the country. And I think the most important thing now is that there are people on the street who are demanding a constituent assembly. And a constituent assembly, in my view, is key. I think that when Chavez won power in 1998 and was installed in 1999, the first thing he did was to organize a constituent assembly whereby people at the base were able to formulate and develop positions with regard to a new constitution. And if anything comes out of the situation in Peru, that there's a more deeper move for a constituent assembly, then it will be great.
Thank you for that. Arnold August, author and journalist from Montreal, a pleasure. And Libre Sankara, thank you, contributor at the Troika Kollective from Miami. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Miko Batagwe and the team, it's goodbye.